It was late October when I decided to head out into the woods and build a cabin. I had been planning the trip for months, dreaming of being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by trees and the stillness of nature. I'd picked a small patch of forest on the outskirts of the Cascades in Oregon, far enough from any town to not be bothered, but close enough that I could still make the trip back if things went wrong. I was 34 years old, still figuring things out, but I needed something simple, something real. The cabin would be my escape, a place to think and rebuild after a tough year. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky already darkening with the promise of rain. The air had that sharp, earthy smell to it, the kind that comes with the change of seasons. The kind that smells like the rain was about to hit. My hands ached from unloading my gear. I had a tent set up for the night, but my goal was to get the cabin started before the rain caught up with me. I'd made a rough blueprint for the cabin weeks before, sketching out the basic layout. It wasn't going to be anything fancy, just a small, one-room cabin with a sleeping loft and a basic stove. I was planning to use all the local materials I could find. I wasn't a carpenter by any means, but I figured I'd give it a shot. There was something satisfying about the idea of building something with my own hands, even if it wasn't perfect. I worked steadily, gathering logs, cutting them to size, and fitting them together like a crude puzzle. The rain had started by then, slow at first, and then picking up in intensity. The sound of it pattering on the leaves above me became almost hypnotic. I couldn't help but think that maybe I'd bitten off more than I could chew. The rain was relentless, soaking me to the bone, but I didn't care. The smell of wet wood and the sound of the rain was oddly comforting. I felt a certain peace, even as the storm raged around me. By the time the sun had completely disappeared behind thick clouds, I had the basic structure of the cabin up. It was still rough, just a shell really, but it was shelter. I was exhausted. I'd barely eaten, and the energy it took to keep going through the rain and the cold was starting to wear me down. I dragged myself inside the tent, shivering as I tried to get warm. It was hard to focus. The cold seeped through my clothes, and the dampness clung to my skin. The tent was small and cramped, and the constant sound of rain on the fabric made it hard to sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the storm outside. I woke up a few hours later, my body sore from the day's labor, but there was a certain satisfaction in it. I could hear the rain still falling, a heavy drumming noise against the tent. The air smelled like wet earth, like the forest was alive, breathing with me. But there was something else in the air too, a sharpness, a quiet stillness that felt wrong. The wind had picked up during the night, howling through the trees, and the rain had turned from a steady downpour into a torrential, unrelenting sheet. It felt like the storm had swallowed the forest whole, like nothing outside existed anymore. The trees were swaying violently in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning under the weight of the storm. The light outside was dim, as if the storm was hiding the sun behind layers of clouds. I decided to get back to work despite the weather. There was no time to waste, and the idea of finishing the cabin kept me moving. I threw on my wet clothes and stepped out into the downpour. The ground was muddy, and my boots sunk into the earth with every step. The storm was so loud now that I could barely hear my own thoughts. The cabin structure stood there like a skeletal frame, waiting for me to finish what I started. I grabbed the next log and started to fit it into place. The rain didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to get worse, pushing me to work faster, harder. The wind kicked up the earth, and every gust of wind felt like it was trying to tear the trees out of the ground. The sound of the forest was a constant roar now, a mix of wind, rain, and the distant crack of thunder. I felt small in it all, insignificant against the power of the storm. I just started placing the roof beams when I heard something. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew louder. A sound that didn't belong. A thud, then another. and another, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, each one closer than the last. I froze, the log in my hands slipping slightly. My heart rate picked up, the pounding in my chest almost drowning out the noise of the storm. I scanned the woods around me. There was nothing, just the blackness of the trees stretching out in every direction. I went back to work, telling myself it was just the wind or a falling branch, but the sound didn't stop, kept coming, slow, methodical, as if someone or something was moving through the woods toward me. The thuds were getting closer. My gut told me to stop, to turn around and get out, but I stayed. Maybe I was being paranoid, maybe I was just overtired, but something about the sound felt wrong. Then I saw it, a figure barely visible in the rain and the shadows of the trees, a shape moving between the trunks. I could barely make it out, but there was no mistaking the movement. It was deliberate, like it was watching me. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The figure disappeared behind a tree, and I held my breath, hoping it would just go away. But I knew it wouldn't. The sound of the rain on the roof seemed to get louder, the storm more intense, but my focus was solely on that spot where the figure had been. I didn't know what to do. Should I hide in the woods? Should I keep working like nothing was wrong? Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, but I stayed put. I didn't know what would happen next. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours, before the figure finally stepped out from behind the trees again. This time it was closer, much closer, and I could see the outline more clearly. Just a man, tall, hunched slightly, wearing a dark hooded coat that blended in with the shadows of the forest. My blood ran cold. My body was frozen, but my mind was racing. What did he want? Was he lost? Or was he something else? I didn't know. The wind howled louder, and I didn't know what to do. I thought about grabbing my gear, but I didn't want to risk making noise. I was caught in a trap of my own making, trapped between the cabin and whatever this person was. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The rain fell harder, and the figure didn't move. He just stood there watching me. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the storm, melting back into the woods. I stood there for what felt like forever, unsure whether to breathe a sigh of relief or run for my life. But I stayed. Couldn't leave, not yet. I couldn't just walk away from everything I had worked for. Hours later, the storm finally began to die down. The wind settled, the rain turned into a light drizzle, and the dark clouds parted slightly, giving way to the first light of dawn. I had no idea what had happened or who that man was, but I didn't want to know. I finished the cabin in the days that followed, working through the lingering tension in the air. I never saw the figure again. I don't know if it was the storm or the isolation, but something about that night stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the silence that followed the sound of heavy footsteps in the rain. I finished the cabin and stayed there for weeks, but I never forgot what I felt that night. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was the realization that the wilderness, no matter how beautiful or peaceful, always holds a darker side, a side that you can never fully prepare for. It had been a long, strange day, the kind of day that you don't realize how bad it's getting until you're already deep into it, far past the point of no return. I'd been looking for some peace, so I'd packed up the old truck and drove out to a cabin near the edge of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. I wasn't sure exactly why I chose that place, but it felt right. Remote, quiet, surrounded by towering trees, and just far enough from civilization to make it feel like a true escape. I was 32 years old and recently divorced. There was a lot on my mind. The silence of the woods seemed like the perfect backdrop to sort through things in my head. I needed time away from everything, The noise, the constant reminders of what my life had become, the people who still hadn't gotten used to the idea that I was on my own again. It had been a few months, but I didn't feel quite ready to face the world yet. The cabin I was staying in was an old thing, built back in the 70s from what I could gather. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-room structure with a small loft for sleeping. The wood had that musty, earth-rich scent, the kind you can't get from modern materials. There were no neighbors for miles, no lights at night except the ones I brought with me. The cabin had electricity, but no internet, no phone signal, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional squeak of the floorboards when I moved around. I unpacked my stuff, checked the small woodpile outside, and got a fire started in the stove. It was early September, the air crisp but still with a warmth from the late summer, so I left the cabin door open a bit. The sounds of the trees swaying and leaves rustling made me feel like I could breathe easier. My dog, Ace, a big mutt I'd adopted a few years ago, wandered around the yard, sniffing every corner. I could tell he was just as curious about the place as I was. As the sun began to set, I made myself a simple dinner, some canned chili, crackers, and a bottle of water. There wasn't much else to do except sit back and watch the fire, listen to the crackling wood. The day had felt long, and the solitude was starting to take its toll. I felt an odd sense of unease creeping in, like something wasn't right, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I figured it was just nerves. I hadn't spent much time alone in a place this remote, especially not since the divorce. It wasn't that I was afraid of the dark or anything, but the silence started to feel heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I got up and closed the cabin door, then locked it. I didn't need to be paranoid, but something didn't sit well. The night carried on and I kept the fire going. Ace was curled up on his bed in the corner, already half asleep. The only sound now was the wind outside, the occasional snap from the fire, and the slow thump of my heart in my chest. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping noise from somewhere outside, just barely audible over the wind. I froze, listening. It came again, more distinct this time, like a rock being lightly tossed against the cabin wall. I stood up, walking quietly toward the window, peeking through the curtains. Nothing, just the darkness of the forest and the dim light from my fire. I stepped back, not sure what to make of it. Maybe an animal, but it didn't sound like a raccoon or a deer, more like someone deliberately throwing something at the cabin. Another tap, followed by a brief pause, and then a louder thud. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped outside, calling Ace to follow me. He was alert now, his ears up and his tail stiff. I scanned the area with the beam, but there was nothing out of place. Just the tall trees and the underbrush. No figures lurking in the shadows. No sign of any animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked the small shed a few yards away from the cabin, thinking maybe someone had been hiding there. But the door was locked and nothing seemed disturbed. My unease didn't fade. It only grew, the kind of feeling that settles in your gut and won't let go. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. That's when I saw it. A movement in the trees. It wasn't clear at first, but something was definitely there. A silhouette just outside the reach of the flashlight, shifting between the trunks of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but my heart rate kicked up a notch. Ace was growling now, low and menacing. The sound of his growl made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took a step back, flicking the flashlight beam toward the shape in the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. I turned in a full circle, but again, nothing. Just the eerie, whispering wind. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The feeling of being alone in the woods, miles away from any help, started to sink in. I didn't know who or what could be out there, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I decided to head back inside, locking the door behind me. My breath was quick, and my pulse was hammering in my chest. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just an animal or some other harmless explanation. I tried to settle down for the night. The fire was still burning, though it was lower now, just a few glowing embers. Ace was at the foot of the bed, still alert but not as tense. I lay down, staring up at the wooden ceiling, my mind racing. But then I heard something else. The cabin creaked. Not just the usual shifting noises from the settling wood, but something more deliberate. A slow, heavy creak that felt like it was coming from the walls themselves. I pushed myself up in bed, gripping the flashlight again. The room was dark now, only the soft glow from the dying fire illuminating the corners. There was nothing there. No intruder, no shadow, just the constant quiet hum of the night. I eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, the kind where you don't fully rest, just wait for the night to pass. When I woke, the sun was just beginning to rise, the sky painted in soft purples and pinks. The morning air was still cool, but it didn't feel as oppressive as the night had. I went outside to collect some more firewood for the stove. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed something strange. There, in the dirt right by the edge of the cabin, were footprints. Human footprints. I froze, staring at them. They weren't fresh, but they were clear enough. There were a few, leading right up to the cabin door and stopping there. The footprints were small, like a woman's, and they were too close to my own tracks for comfort. I walked around the cabin again, looking for any sign of someone who might have been out there. The footprints weren't far, just close enough to make me uneasy. But nothing had been stolen, nothing had been disturbed. No sign of an actual threat except for those damn footprints. I stayed another night, the unease gnawing at me. But nothing happened again. No strange noises, no more footprints. It was like the woods had swallowed whatever had been out there. When I finally packed up and left, I felt a strange sense of relief. The cabin was quiet once more, and I didn't look back. I'd gotten what I came for. A few days to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. And for some reason, I wasn't entirely sure I was alone in the woods. It was a late autumn evening when I decided to take a break from the noise and chaos of the city. My dog, Scout, a medium-sized mixed breed with a shaggy coat, was my only companion on this trip. We'd been close since I adopted him 3 years ago, and I trusted him more than anyone else. I had heard about a small, old cabin tucked away deep in the woods near a little town called Westbrook, about 2 hours north of where I lived in Maine. It was supposed to be quiet and peaceful, perfect for clearing my head. I didn't know then that it would turn into something much different. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The dirt rode a narrow, winding path that was barely visible under the dense tree cover. The cabin itself was old, its logs weathered and covered in patches of moss. The roof had seen better days, but it still looked like it would hold up. There was a small, overgrown yard around it, with an old fire pit that hadn't seen flames in years. The place had an eerie charm to it, like it was frozen in time. But that didn't bother me. I was here for solitude, not to critique architecture. I parked my car about 50 feet away from the cabin, and Scout jumped out, already sniffing the air. It was chilly, and I was thankful for the heavy jacket I'd brought. The woods around me were thick with towering pines, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. I opened the trunk and grabbed my gear: a small stove, sleeping bag, some canned food, and a flashlight. I wasn't planning on staying more than a night, just a quick getaway to reset. After setting up inside, I built a small fire in the cabin's stone fireplace. The crackling of the wood filled the silence. The air outside was biting, but it felt warmer in here. The cabin smelled like old wood and musty blankets, but I didn't mind. Scout lay near the fire, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor. I could hear the wind picking up outside, making the branches sway and creak. It was soothing at first, but after a while, I began to notice something strange. There was something almost too quiet about the night. I didn't think much of it at the time, but as the hours passed, I started hearing little noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind shaking branches, or maybe a raccoon rooting around. But as time wore on, I became more and more aware of the sounds. Something was out there. Scout was sitting up now, ears perked, his nose twitching. He wasn't barking, but I could tell he was on edge. He never acted like this, even when we'd gone on hikes in the woods before. The wind howled, and the night got darker. I started feeling an uneasy tension that I couldn't explain. The fire flickered and cast shadows across the room, making everything look like it was moving. Scout stood up and walked to the window, his paws clicking against the wooden floor. He sat there, staring into the dark. I approached him, but before I could ask what he was looking at, there was a sharp knock on the door. I froze. It was an odd sound, not like the usual creaks of an old house settling. It was deliberate. 3 knocks, quick and measured. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a passing hunter or someone from the town, I thought. Still, the thought of opening the door to anyone at this hour sent a chill down my spine. No one was supposed to be out here. I didn't hear any vehicles when I arrived. I cautiously peeked through the cabin's small front window, but all I could see was the endless blackness of the trees. The knock came again. 3 quick raps. This time I felt the weight of it. There was no way I could ignore it now. Scout was growling softly at the door, his tail low. His usual calm demeanor was gone. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly moved toward the door, trying to decide whether I should open it or call for help. I knew nobody would hear me out here if I screamed. My phone had no signal, one of the reasons I came out here to begin with. I took a deep breath, then slowly turned the doorknob. Before I could open it fully, I saw something on the other side, a shadow in the dark. It didn't move, but it was there, standing just outside the threshold. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively pulled the door back. That's when I heard it, a voice. Soft, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. It was a man's voice, low and grating, saying only, "Let me in." Scout lunged toward the door, his growl turning into a deep, menacing bark. I stepped back, heart pounding, my mind racing. Who the hell was that? Why were they out there? I knew I had to act fast. I slammed the door shut and turned the lock, feeling the weight of the decision I'd just made. My breath was coming in short gasps. I didn't know what to do next. I wasn't a fighter, and I wasn't prepared for this kind of situation. All I wanted was a quiet night, not to be terrorized by a stranger in the woods. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, hoping maybe, just maybe, I'd get a signal. But as expected, there was nothing. I was completely cut off. The wind howled louder outside, making the cabin creak and groan. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even Scout had quieted down, though his body was tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. For what felt like hours, I sat in the dark with only the glow of the fire to keep me company. The quiet of the woods had returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It felt heavier now, as though something was watching me from the dark corners of the room. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting the knocks to return, but they never did. Eventually, the cold began creeping in through the cracks in the walls, and I knew I had to keep the fire going. My mind raced with questions. Who was out there? What did they want? And why hadn't they tried anything more when they had the chance? Was it a warning? I couldn't make sense of it. As the night wore on, exhaustion finally took over. I closed my eyes for a moment, just to rest. But I didn't sleep well. Every small sound, every creak of the cabin kept me awake. The night felt endless, like it was dragging on. I finally mustered the strength to check the door again around midnight. I approached it carefully, not sure what I was expecting to find. But when I peered through the window, there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, just the dark, empty woods. The next morning, I woke up early. I hadn't gotten much sleep, but I knew it was time to leave. The sense of unease hadn't lifted, and I wasn't going to stay here another night. As I packed up my things, Scout was back to his usual self, though he still seemed a little skittish, sticking close to me as I moved around the cabin. When I stepped outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint light over the trees. The air was crisp, but the woods seemed less foreboding in the daylight. There were no signs of anyone being out there, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if the night before had never happened. I don't know who was at that door or why they were out there, but I'm sure of one thing: I'll never go back to that cabin again. Some things are better left alone in the woods. It was late autumn when I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin I'd rented in the rolling hills of the United Kingdom. A friend had recommended the place, a small, secluded cabin in the middle of a forest about an hour north of Bristol. The kind of spot where you'd expect to hear only the wind and the rustling of leaves. Perfect, I thought, for a break from the noise of city life. I needed it. The break had been long overdue, especially after a hectic few months at work. The cabin itself wasn't much. A small stone structure, probably built in the early 1900s, with a slanted roof covered in moss and ivy. The moment I arrived, I noticed the air had a crisp chill to it, sharper than I expected for this time of year. The cabin was surrounded by trees, with nothing but thick woods as far as the eye could see. There were no neighbors, no other houses in sight, just a quiet, still expanse of forest. I unloaded my things, lit the fireplace, and set up for a couple of peaceful days away from the hustle. The first evening passed without issue. The wind howled outside, but the warmth from the fire and the isolation felt comforting. I had everything I needed: a good book, some music on my phone, and an open view of the dark forest beyond the cabin. But that night, around midnight, something felt off. I was sitting by the fire, scrolling through my phone when I heard a noise outside. It was subtle at first, a sort of scraping sound. I stood up, expecting maybe a branch scraping against the cabin. But as I peered out the window, I didn't see anything unusual. The wind had picked up, causing the trees to sway violently, so it was hard to tell if there was something or someone out there. I went back to the fire, trying to shrug off the unease. But the noise came again, a scraping followed by what almost sounded like footsteps. I waited, straining to hear over the howling wind. My mind started to race. Could it be an animal? Perhaps a deer or a fox? I told myself that was the most likely explanation, but deep down I wasn't convinced. I decided to check outside. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch, my boots crunching on the gravel beneath me. The wind was biting, and the trees above me groaned in the gusts. I scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement, but everything was eerily still. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but after a few moments of standing there, feeling like an idiot, I returned to the cabin. That's when I saw her. At first, it was just a shape at the edge of the trees, too far away for me to make out. My heart skipped. The figure was tall, impossibly still, just standing there in the dark. I froze, unsure of what to do. I couldn't see her clearly, but something about the shape felt wrong. It wasn't just the stillness. There was a weirdness in how she stood, as though her posture was unnatural. The moonlight cast strange shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickly closed the door behind me, my breath quickening. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for a moment, I considered calling the police. But who would they even send? I was miles from any kind of town. No, that was overkill. But what was she doing out there, just standing in the dark like that? I stayed by the window, peeking through the curtains. After what felt like hours, the figure began to move, slowly retreating back into the forest. I waited a few more minutes, not daring to step outside. My mind raced. Was she a local? A hiker? It was unlikely, but the thought of a random stranger lurking around wasn't one I could shake. As the night stretched on, sleep became impossible. Every noise I heard, every gust of wind, had me jumping at shadows. I ended up staying up for the rest of the night, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to happen. By morning, exhaustion had taken hold, but I tried to push through, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. I made coffee in the morning, sitting by the window and scanning the woods, but the whole place felt different. Felt like someone else was there, watching, waiting. I decided to spend the day hiking, maybe clear my head. If I was lucky, the fresh air would do me good, and I'd shake off the weirdness of the previous night. I made my way through the woods, sticking to the narrow path I had found earlier on my map. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows even in the early afternoon light. As I walked, the noise of the forest filled my ears, the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds. But every few steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like I wasn't alone out there. It wasn't until I reached the clearing that I saw her again. This time, she was much closer, standing by the base of an old, gnarled oak tree, her back turned toward me. The same figure, tall, unnaturally still, with long, disheveled hair that seemed to hang like tangled vines around her shoulders. She wore an old, faded dress that looked like it belonged to another era, and I could see that her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. I froze in my tracks. It wasn't just the eerie stillness of her presence. It was the way she seemed completely out of place, like she didn't belong in this time or this place. Something in my gut told me that she wasn't someone I was meant to encounter. Not like this. I turned to leave, not wanting to risk anything. But as I did, I heard her move. Her footsteps, slow and deliberate, came closer. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I hurried through the woods, trying to make my way back to the cabin. I could hear her footsteps behind me, following at a distance. I knew she was still there. I could feel it. My heart pounded as I pushed myself harder, ignoring the branches that slapped at my face and the uneven terrain beneath my feet. By the time I made it back to the cabin, I was gasping for breath, my hands shaking. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, bolting every latch. For a long time, I just stood there, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. Eventually, the sun dipped low in the sky, and I decided that I had had enough. I was leaving the cabin that night. No more staying alone in the woods, no more waiting for something to happen. I packed my things quickly, grabbing everything I needed, and called a local taxi service. Within half an hour, a car was on its way to pick me up. I never wanted to see that cabin again, or the woman standing in the forest. When I got back to the city, I did some research on the area. It wasn't a place that came up in tourist brochures, and there weren't many locals around. What I did find, however, was a small article about the area's history. It mentioned an old legend about a woman who had once lived in those woods, an isolated hermit who had disappeared decades ago. The details were vague, but it was enough to make me wonder if there was more to her than I realized. Regardless, the experience was enough to make me question what I had seen. Was it real? Had I imagined it all? I would never know for sure, but I knew one thing: I would never set foot in that cabin again. And to this day, I still have no idea who or what that woman really was. The sun had barely set when I pulled my old truck into the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. I could feel the chill of early autumn creeping in, and the dry, crisp scent of pine and earth filled the air. My father had left me the cabin when he passed last year, and I'd been wanting to get away for a while. Just me, my rifle, and some peace and quiet. The place had always been a refuge for him, and now I figured it might help me get my mind off things too. The cabin was small, just a single room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a loft above. Nothing fancy. It was tucked deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town, hidden by a thick wall of trees. I was in my mid-30s, used to solitude, and hunting had always been a way for me to clear my head. It had been a long drive, and I was eager to get settled in. I unloaded my gear, grabbed my rifle from the truck, and made my way up the creaky wooden steps to the porch. The door was old but solid, and I locked it behind me after stepping inside. The cabin was cold, and I wasted no time getting the fire going. As I set the kindling and logs in the stove, the crackling sound of the flames felt oddly comforting. The place had always had a certain charm, though tonight it felt different. I went about unpacking my things, setting up a cot in the corner, hanging my jacket on a hook by the door, and placing my rifle next to the chair by the fireplace. After setting up a small supply of food, I sat down in front of the fire, the heat warming my face, and tried to relax. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees. It wasn't a full storm, but the gusts were strong enough to make the cabin groan. I could hear the branches scratching against the walls. It was enough to make anyone jumpy, but I told myself to focus on the hunt ahead of me. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, something outside seemed to shift. A twig snapping, the wind pulling the trees, the echo of a distant howl. It wasn't until well after midnight that I finally drifted off, my mind still buzzing with thoughts of the hunt. The next morning, I was up early. The sun hadn't even peeked over the horizon, and the fog hung low in the valley. I grabbed my rifle and a thermos of coffee, making sure to leave the cabin as quietly as possible. The woods were still, save for the occasional bird call or rustle of an animal in the underbrush. As I made my way down the familiar trail that led to the small creek, my boots sinking softly into the damp earth, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I set up near the creek, waiting for any sign of game. I could hear the water flowing gently over the rocks and the quiet hum of the forest around me. But the stillness felt almost too quiet. There were no squirrels scampering through the trees, no birds fluttering by. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. After a few hours, the unease in my stomach grew. I hadn't seen a single animal, which was unusual for this time of year. I decided to head back to the cabin. The woods had always been a place of peace for me, but that day, they felt different, almost oppressive. It was as though the trees were closing in, the shadows too thick, the sounds too muted. When I reached the cabin, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I had locked, was now slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my rifle and cautiously approached. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the hinge groaning in protest. The interior of the cabin was just as I had left it, but something was off. The air was stale, heavier than it should have been. I slowly checked every room. Nothing seemed out of place. My cot was still where I'd left it, the food untouched. I looked around the small cabin, trying to shake the feeling that someone had been here. Someone who hadn't just walked in, but who had been watching. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The wind had died down, and the woods outside were completely still. I felt like I was being watched, like I wasn't alone. But that didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone since I'd arrived. The unease didn't let up as I locked the door behind me again. I sat down by the fire, staring into the flames. It was then that I heard it, a soft, muffled thud coming from outside. My muscles tensed instinctively. I had left my rifle by the door, but I grabbed it anyway and moved to the window, peering out through the thick curtains. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. I shook my head, telling myself I was just imagining things. It was probably just a deer or a loose branch. But when I heard it again, closer this time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the rifle and stepped outside, my boots crunching softly against the dry leaves. The air was cold, and the ground beneath my feet felt damp with dew. I scanned the area carefully, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No movement, no sounds. Just the trees and the long shadows stretching across the forest floor. I made my way slowly to the edge of the clearing near the cabin, rifle held at the ready. My mind was racing, heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt like an eternity, but when I finally reached the edge of the woods, I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing in the shadows of the trees. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. It just stood there, motionless, watching. The longer I stared, the more it seemed like it was just waiting for something. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I suddenly realized how exposed I was. I hadn't thought to bring my flashlight, and the dim light of dusk wasn't enough to make out any details. I tightened my grip on the rifle, my finger itching near the trigger. The figure didn't move. My instincts told me to act fast. I stepped forward, trying to close the distance. But as I did, the figure slowly turned and disappeared into the trees. I broke into a run, adrenaline coursing through my veins. But when I reached the spot where it had been standing, there was nothing. Not a trace, not a sound. I spent the rest of the day inside, checking the locks on the doors and windows again and again, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been there. The woods had always been silent, but now they felt alive, like they were holding their breath, waiting. By evening, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to spend another night here. Whatever had happened, whatever I had seen, it wasn't worth risking it. I grabbed my things, packed up, and left the cabin behind. The air felt fresher as I drove down the winding dirt road, the sound of my tires crunching over the gravel loud in the quiet night. I never went back. I don't know who or what I saw in those woods that day, but I didn't need to find out. Sometimes the woods just have a way of making you feel small, like they're watching you, waiting for you to leave. And that's exactly what I did. I had always loved the solitude of nature. There was something about being away from the chaos of the world, completely isolated, that gave me peace. That's why, in the fall of 2017, I decided to take a week off work and rent a cabin up in the mountains of New Mexico. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small, wooden structure tucked away in the trees. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove for heat and a fireplace for cooking. It was the perfect retreat to get away from everything and clear my mind. I arrived late in the afternoon on a Wednesday. The drive had been long, the roads narrow and winding, the landscape becoming more rugged as I climbed higher into the mountains. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a sense of excitement. Finally, peace and quiet. The cabin was simple, surrounded by dense trees, with a small clearing in front where the weathered porch swing creaked in the breeze. It looked like something out of an old movie, rustic and serene. After unpacking my things and settling inside, I lit a fire in the stove, making sure to prepare everything for the night ahead. The sun set early that time of year, and the cold quickly followed. The wind picked up, rustling the trees outside, and the cabin creaked in response. I sat near the fire, enjoying the silence, the crackling of the flames the only sound. I had brought my dog, Max, along. A big, shaggy German shepherd who was as loyal as they come. That night, the wind howled around the cabin, but I was cozy inside, with Max curled up beside me. It was nearly midnight when I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing against the cabin, but then it became more distinct, tapping like a knock on the door. It was strange, especially since I hadn't seen anyone for miles when I drove in. I stood up, slowly, trying to figure out what it was. Max raised his head, his ears perked up. The tapping came again, this time louder. It was rhythmic, almost as if someone was trying to get my attention. I didn't know whether to be scared or curious. I walked cautiously to the door and opened it, half expecting to see someone there. But the only thing I saw was the empty porch, bathed in the pale light of the moon. No one was there. Nothing seemed out of place. The wind gusted, and I closed the door, shaking my head, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping in. I had just turned around when Max started growling low in his throat, a deep, rumbling sound that sent a chill down my spine. His body was tense, his eyes locked onto the darkness just beyond the cabin. I walked over to him, kneeling down, trying to calm him, but he wouldn't stop. His hackles were raised, and I could tell something was off. Then, I heard it again, the sound of tapping, but this time, it was coming from the window next to the door. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly, I turned my gaze toward the glass. The reflection of the moonlight on the window made it difficult to see anything beyond it, but there was something out there. I could feel it. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling as I flicked it on. The beam of light swept across the porch, but there was nothing there. Max's growling grew louder, and I realized he wasn't just growling at the outside, he was looking at something inside. I slowly turned around, scanning the cabin with the flashlight, but saw nothing unusual. My stomach churned with an unsettling feeling. There was something wrong, something I couldn't place. I decided to go to bed, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the occasional creak of the cabin. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of Max barking. I shot out of bed, my heart racing. Max was standing by the window, his barking frantic now, almost desperate. I rushed over to him and looked outside, but again, there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I looked around the cabin. It was silent again, but the tension in the air was palpable. Suddenly, I heard a new sound, footsteps, heavy, slow steps moving around the cabin. I froze. The footsteps weren't the light, scurrying kind of animal footsteps, but deliberate like a person walking, but the sound was too deep and heavy. I felt my pulse quicken. Max was no longer barking, just staring at the door, his body rigid. I grabbed the shotgun I had kept by the door for protection and made my way quietly to the window. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered outside. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the wind. My grip on the shotgun tightened as I stood there, heart pounding. Then I saw it. Just outside the light of the porch, at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall, hunched over, almost crawling on all fours, but with an unnatural movement that didn't look human. The thing had a twisted, grotesque shape, and as it stepped closer, I could see the moonlight reflecting off its pale skin, almost like it was too smooth, too perfect. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, but they weren't human eyes. They were wide, yellow, and empty. I froze. Everything inside me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. The creature stepped closer, and I could hear its breath, a deep, rasping sound, like something trying to catch its breath after running for miles. Max started barking again, but now it was different. It was no longer just a warning. There was fear in his voice, The thing outside was getting closer, moving toward the door. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to stay inside, to stay quiet, to wait for it to leave. But there was no telling what this thing was or what it wanted. I slowly backed away from the window, holding the shotgun at the ready. I could hear the thing now, scratching at the door, its long, twisted fingers scraping across the wood. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a brief moment, I thought it might have gone away. I waited for what felt like hours, my body tensed, every nerve on edge. Finally, I gathered the courage to peek through the window again. The thing was gone, vanished back into the trees. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching the shadows outside, waiting for any sign of movement. When morning finally came, the world seemed oddly quiet, as if the night had never happened. Max was still on edge, but the sun brought a sense of safety. I packed up my things and left the cabin before noon. I wasn't sure what I had seen that night, but I knew I didn't want to stay another night to find out. As I drove down the winding mountain road, I passed a small clearing with a faded sign that read, Skinwalker Canyon. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had heard stories about skinwalkers, but I had always thought they were just myths. But now, after what I had experienced, I wasn't so sure. I didn't look back. The night started like any other on a solo trip to the Appalachian Mountains. I had rented a small, rustic cabin to escape the chaos of city life for a while. My name's Max, and I'd recently turned 30. The idea was to recharge and reconnect with nature. No cell service, no distractions, just the wind in the trees and the crackling of the fire. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. It was built of rough-hewn logs, tucked away in a remote part of the forest, with only a gravel path leading to it. The smell of pine and fresh earth filled the air as I unloaded my gear from the truck, and the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The view from the porch was breathtaking, mountain ridges stretching out as far as the eye could see, their peaks covered in a blanket of green. I spent the first few hours setting up, gathering firewood, and getting comfortable. As dusk fell, I made a small fire outside, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the trees. The temperature had started to drop, but the fire kept things warm enough. There was a chill in the air, though, one that made me feel uneasy, like the forest was watching me. But I chalked it up to the natural isolation. This wasn't exactly a luxury resort. Dinner was simple, some canned soup and crackers, and as the night deepened, I retreated into the cabin to get some rest. The inside was cozy, with a small wood stove in the corner and a few old chairs around a wooden table. A couple of mismatched rugs covered the hardwood floors, and the walls were decorated with old hunting trophies. Nothing too extravagant, just enough to remind you that this place had been here for a long time. I locked the door behind me and sat by the stove, reading a book I had brought with me. The fire popped and crackled, the only sound in the otherwise quiet cabin. The wind outside had picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and occasionally, a branch would scrape against the roof. But that was normal for a cabin in the woods, right? As I settled into the book, a faint noise broke the silence. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, or maybe the trees shifting in the breeze. But then it came again, a soft tapping on the window. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. Maybe it was an animal, one of the local critters. Still, there was something off about the sound. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I slowly stood up, my mind racing. I didn't want to just peek out the window. I knew that could be dangerous. Instead, I moved quietly through the cabin, checking the locks on the doors and the windows. Everything was secure. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. Could just be a freak occurrence. Maybe a branch had brushed against the window, or an animal had knocked something over outside. I returned to my seat by the fire and tried to settle my nerves. But as I did, I realized something was off. The air felt heavier now, more oppressive. It wasn't the cold. It was a strange, unsettling feeling that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight from the table and walked over to the window, shining the beam outside. The light cut through the dark, revealing nothing but the shadows of the trees. But then I saw something, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so. It stood perfectly still, just outside the perimeter of the light, almost as if it were waiting for me to notice. I couldn't see any details, no face, no clothes, but there was something unmistakably wrong about the silhouette. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. My mind raced. What the hell was that? Was it someone out there? But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? And why wasn't it moving? I pulled the blinds down quickly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the flashlight, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. There had to be an explanation, right? Maybe a hiker lost in the woods? But no, it didn't make sense. I hadn't heard a car drive up. There were no other cabins around for miles. I sat in silence for a few minutes, debating what to do. I considered grabbing my gear and leaving, but the road was treacherous at best, and I knew it would take hours to get out of here. If something was out there, I wasn't going to outrun it. Besides, I wasn't sure I could even get to the truck. I would have to brave the dark, and that was a terrifying thought. Then came the knock at the door, a sharp, deliberate rap against the wood, followed by a long pause. Whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly how to make its presence felt. I didn't move. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in. My flashlight flickered as I held it in my trembling hand, and I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. What the hell was going on? I didn't have the courage to open the door and face whoever or whatever was out there. Instead, I stayed as still as possible, listening. My breathing was too loud in the silence. Every little sound seemed amplified, like the wind outside was carrying the sound of my heartbeat. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. I felt a cold sweat on my skin. There was no way I could let whoever it was inside. But the longer I waited, the more I realized that staying in here wasn't safe either. Whoever was outside had already shown they knew how to get my attention. What else were they capable of? I moved toward the back door, trying to be as quiet as possible. I was going to make a run for it, head down the path to my truck. It was risky, but it was the only way I might get out of this situation. I opened the door slowly, peeking outside. The light from the cabin illuminated the gravel path, but the figure was gone. There was no sign of anyone, no movement in the trees, just the whisper of the wind. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out the door, running down the path with everything I had. I didn't dare look back until I reached my truck. When I finally reached the truck, I slammed the door shut, my hands still shaking. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the narrow, winding road toward the nearest town. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if something had followed me. The fear gnawed at me, even as the lights of the town finally came into view. Whatever had happened out there, I wasn't going to stay to find out. The next morning, I called the cabin's owner to report what had happened. He said there had been rumors of someone, maybe a hunter or a wanderer, lurking around the area, but that didn't explain the figure I had seen. I've never been back to that cabin. The fear, the sense of being watched, still lingers, and I've learned my lesson. Some places aren't meant to be explored, no matter how beautiful they may seem. hadn't planned to spend my weekend in a remote farmhouse, but here I was. The cabin sat on a piece of land just outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a small town nestled between hills, surrounded by nothing but fields and woods. It was late autumn, with the crisp air biting at my skin as I carried the last of the supplies into the cabin, the shadows already growing long as the sun started to dip behind the hills. The cabin itself was old enough to make me wonder how long it had been since anyone else had stayed here. I didn't mind it, though. There's something calming about being alone in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be a chance to unplug from the noise of the world and enjoy a quiet weekend. But as soon as I arrived, the unease started to settle in. It wasn't the cabin itself, but the land around it that felt off. There was something wrong about it, something that wasn't immediately obvious but was present the moment you stepped out the door. It felt abandoned, like the earth itself had forgotten that people were supposed to live here. I didn't have much time to think about it. The cold forced me inside, where the warmth of the old wood and the crackling fire gave me a sense of comfort. I set about making dinner, the smell of roasting vegetables and stew filling the cabin. It was peaceful, too peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you wonder if the silence is something deeper, something that's hiding something just out of sight. I had been alone for the past few hours, and there hadn't been a single sound beyond the crackle of the fire. No birds, no wind, nothing. I tried to push the thought out of my head. After all, it was just a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was just me here, no one else. That night, the wind picked up, but not in the usual way. It wasn't the soft whisper of a breeze or the sharp gusts that usually come with autumn storms. This wind felt purposeful. It howled outside the cabin, rattling the windows and making the wooden beams creak. I kept the fire burning bright, knowing that the warmth would keep me grounded. But still, my eyes kept darting to the windows, to the shadows. There was a noise outside, a slow, deliberate rustling. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was out there. I froze. My heart pounded against my ribs, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. My breath quickened as I stared at the door, wondering if it would open, if someone would come in. But the noise stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. And then I heard it again, a low scrape, as if something was dragging along the ground. Slowly, I stood up from the chair and crept toward the window. I had a small flashlight in my pocket, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. It was dark outside, but the beam of moonlight that cut through the clouds was enough to make out the shape of something moving in the distance. Person, or what looked like a person. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were wearing something dark. Too dark for this time of year, almost like they were trying to blend into the night itself. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and they weren't walking, they were dragging themselves forward. The person would stop, pause, and then shift a little more forward, like they were struggling with every movement. My hand shook as I gripped the flashlight. I wanted to run, but where would I go? The roads were miles away, and the nearest town was over an hour's drive. There was no phone signal here either. I was completely alone, isolated with whatever that thing was outside. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Should I lock the doors? Should I stay hidden? My eyes darted to the fireplace, and I quickly grabbed the iron poker, holding it tight in my hands. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I knew I wasn't going to sit around and wait to find out. The scraping noise outside stopped again, and this time, I swore I heard something else. Muttering. It was so faint that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it or if it was real, but it sounded off, like it wasn't even human. Suddenly, the door rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I jumped back, my heart leaping into my throat. The handle turned, and I held my breath, waiting to hear the door give way. But it didn't. There was no forceful entry, no crash. just the sound of someone pushing against the door. Then silence. I waited and waited. The minutes felt like hours, but nothing happened. I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion, because when I opened my eyes, the first light of morning was creeping through the small cracks in the cabin's wooden walls. The storm had passed, but a quiet stillness had taken its place. The kind that makes you feel like something's wrong without quite being able to put your finger on it. The air outside was fresh, crisp, but when I looked out the window, there was no sign of the figure. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been out there. The whole day, I kept my distance from the doors, checking the windows every few minutes. I had no idea who it was or why they were here, but they'd made no attempt to enter. Whoever or whatever it was, it had simply left. But it didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like an unfinished story. By the end of the day, I was starting to relax again. The tension was still there, but I was beginning to believe it was all in my head. I had no proof of anything, no physical sign that someone had been outside. There were no footprints in the mud, no traces of movement in the leaves, nothing. But my mind kept returning to the strange figure in the darkness, dragging itself across the land. It wasn't until the sun set again that the unease returned. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it once more, the scraping sound, faint but unmistakable. This time it was closer. I immediately went to the window again, but there was nothing. No person, no shape, just the darkness of the land stretching out before me. But then I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There were marks, deep gouges in the ground, running in a straight line from the edge of the woods to just outside my cabin. The earth had been disturbed. Someone had been here last night, and now they were gone. I locked all the doors and windows that night and kept the lights on. I stayed awake until the first rays of morning broke over the horizon. Whatever it was out there, it wasn't going to come near me again. And when I left the cabin the next morning, I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'll never forget the feeling that the land itself was hiding something. Something that wasn't ready to let go of this place. And I'm not sure I want to know what it was, but I won't go back to that cabin. Not ever again. The wind was picking up as I pulled my old, beat-up truck up to the cabin. The tires crunched over the gravel driveway, kicking up dust in the dry summer air. I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I booked this place, but I needed some time alone. Time to get away, time to think. I wasn't looking for a picturesque cabin by a sparkling lake or anything. This wasn't some fancy Airbnb with polished wood floors and modern appliances. This was an old cabin, tucked away in the woods somewhere off the beaten path. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The kind of place you wouldn't be surprised to find abandoned if you were looking for it. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I didn't feel like I had to. My friends and family had their own lives and I had mine. I was 32 years old, a mechanic by trade and a simple guy. I liked solitude and nature, even if that meant roughing it a little. I figured I'd spend a few nights at the cabin, clear my head, and then head back to the hustle of the real world. The cabin itself was built from what looked like weathered, gray logs, with a sagging roof and chipped paint on the windows. The porch, if you could call it that, was little more than a few planks nailed to the front of the house, barely able to hold a chair. The door creaked as I opened it, sending a wave of dust into the air, and the smell of mildew hit me like a punch in the face. But that didn't bother me much. I was here for the quiet, and I'd have to get used to it. Inside, the cabin was cold, though it was late afternoon and the sun was still shining outside. The main room had a stone fireplace in the center, with an old leather chair that looked like it had seen better days. The furniture was sparse, and there was a small kitchen to the side, with rusty appliances and an old cast-iron stove. I noticed some dried-up plants hanging from the ceiling, and a few mismatched mugs on the counter. It was the kind of place where people might have come to escape from the world, but even that seemed to have faded away over time. I unloaded my stuff, setting up a cot in the corner of the room. I didn't plan on staying long enough to do much more than sleep here, but as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The place felt neglected, but not just in the way you'd expect an abandoned cabin to feel. It felt like something had been left behind on purpose, like someone had walked away and decided not to come back. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the fireplace, ate some canned beans, and read a book by the dim light of my flashlight. The wind howled outside, the kind of gusts that make you think a storm is coming. But the air was dry and the sky was clear. It was just the sound of the woods, a reminder that I was far from civilization. I woke up the next morning to a chilly breeze creeping through the cracks in the walls. I made a pot of coffee over the stove and stepped outside to get some fresh air. The woods around me were dense, the trees tall and dark, with patches of sunlight breaking through the branches. It was beautiful in a way, but there was a heaviness to it that I couldn't shake. That day, I decided to go for a walk around the property, to stretch my legs and explore. I grabbed my jacket and set off into the woods, the dry leaves crunching underfoot. The further I walked, the more I realized just how isolated this cabin was. There were no nearby neighbors, no hiking trails, nothing. Just woods and wilderness stretching for miles. As I wandered, I came across an old well, covered in vines and dirt. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but there was something strange about it. The ground around the well seemed disturbed, like someone had been digging there recently. I knelt down and ran my fingers through the dirt, but didn't find anything unusual. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my hands, and took one last look at the well before heading back toward the cabin. That evening, the wind picked up again, and the temperature dropped even further. I built another fire, but it didn't warm the room much. I couldn't get comfortable, and I kept hearing strange sounds outside. Twigs snapping, footsteps in the leaves, like someone or something was moving around in the woods. I told myself it was probably just animals, maybe deer or raccoons. The wind was playing tricks on my mind, but the noises continued through the night, growing louder and closer until I couldn't ignore them anymore. It sounded like someone was walking right outside the cabin, pacing back and forth, never getting too close but never leaving either. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but something inside me told me I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up my things quickly, more hurriedly than I would have liked. As I was about to head out the door, something caught my eye, a shape in the woods just beyond the edge of the cabin. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a person, standing still, watching me. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't moving, just standing there, blending into the trees. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were staring at me. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't about to confront whoever this was. I grabbed my keys, rushed out of the cabin, and slammed the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start my truck. It roared to life on the third try, and I peeled out of the gravel driveway, not looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching me go. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a diner to collect my thoughts. I told the waitress about the cabin, about the weird noises, and about the figure in the woods. She raised an eyebrow and leaned in closer. "You're not the first one to say something like that," she said quietly. "That cabin's been abandoned for years. People used to stay there, but not anymore. Too many people go missing around that area. Some say it's the land. Others think there's something off about the place." I didn't know what to believe, but I wasn't about to go back there to find out. The truck rumbled along the highway as I left the town behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, but I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. It had been a rough week, the kind that drags you down without warning. I was looking for some solitude, away from the noise and stress of everyday life, a chance to clear my head. So, when I stumbled upon an old, forgotten cabin deep in the woods, I thought I'd found the perfect spot. It wasn't just any cabin either. It was right next to an old graveyard, a creepy one. No one had cared for it in years. Some of the gravestones were cracked, with moss growing over them like a blanket, and the trees around it felt ancient, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. I had heard about this place from an old friend, a guy named Alan, who was into exploring abandoned spots. He had been up here once with some friends, but he warned me, "Don't get too close to the graveyard," he said. He didn't really explain why, but something about the way he said it made me think twice. Of course, curiosity always wins, so I ended up there anyway. The first thing that hit me when I got there was the smell of damp wood and decay. The cabin was falling apart, barely standing. It had a rusted tin roof, and the windows were boarded up, but the door creaked open with a gentle push. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of mildew tickled my nose. It wasn't the most welcoming place, but it had its own grim charm. I set up my stuff near the old stone fireplace. I wasn't planning to stay for more than a couple of nights, but something about the place felt off. It wasn't the graveyard that bothered me. It was the silence. No birds, no animals, not even the wind in the trees. Just stillness, unnatural stillness. I had brought my camping gear with me, and after setting up, I went to get some firewood. The graveyard was right there, just beyond the clearing. The tombstones seemed to be watching me as I walked past. I quickly grabbed a few logs from a fallen tree and got back to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. That evening, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The crackling of the wood was the only sound. I tried to read a book, but my eyes kept darting back to the graveyard. There was something eerie about it, something that I couldn't quite explain. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on me. As night fell, the cabin grew colder, and I wrapped myself in a blanket. The fire was dying down, and the shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside, made my heart race. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A soft shuffling sound, like footsteps on gravel. I held my breath, listening. My first thought was that someone was out there, maybe someone who lived in the area, though I knew no one was supposed to be around. It was far too remote. The footsteps stopped, and then nothing. Complete silence again. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling. Every time I thought I was about to drift off, I heard the noise again. Slowly, cautiously, I got up and grabbed the flashlight. The beam of light flickered across the cabin as I moved toward the window. I peeked outside. The graveyard was now bathed in an eerie glow, the moonlight shining down on the cracked stones. I couldn't see anything moving, but I felt that same oppressive presence. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, a raccoon, maybe. But then I heard the footsteps again, louder this time. They were coming from the graveyard. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid, but something inside me urged me to check it out. I don't know why. Maybe it was my stubbornness, Or maybe it was that nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. I moved toward the graveyard, the beams of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I got closer, I could hear the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. I thought for sure someone was out there, maybe a trespasser or a local who didn't know better. But as I reached the first row of tombstones, I froze. A figure was standing by one of the graves, facing away from me. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He stood unnaturally still, like he was waiting for something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't sure if I should call out, but I didn't want to spook him. So I just stood there for a while, watching him. The wind picked up then, rustling the leaves in the trees. The man didn't move. His silhouette was now outlined against the moon, and that's when I saw it, his hand. It was too pale, too unnatural, almost bone white in the moonlight. And then I saw the way his fingers curled, almost as if they were stretching. My heart stopped. This wasn't just someone wandering around. There was something wrong about him, something that made my stomach churn. Slowly, I took a step back, but the man didn't notice. He remained there, motionless, as if he was part of the graveyard itself. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted back to the cabin, my pulse pounding in my ears. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop running. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it. I didn't even dare look out the window. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring into the darkness. Whatever it was out there in the graveyard, it wasn't normal. It wasn't just a random person. I didn't know what it was, but it felt wrong. By morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to stay another second. The silence of the night was unbearable, and whatever had been out there, it wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. I glanced back at the graveyard as I drove away, but the man, if that's what he was gone. The tombstone stood, silent and unmoving, as if nothing had happened. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. It didn't seem like the kind of story that would make sense to anyone, but the memory stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I kept thinking about that figure in the graveyard, the way he just stood there, as if he belonged to the place. It was almost as if the graveyard was watching me, waiting for me to leave. And I did, but I didn't feel free. Not really. I'd left the cabin, but something had followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to leave, that I had disturbed something or someone. Maybe I had been warned, but I hadn't listened. I don't know what was out there, but I wasn't about to go back and find out. It was mid-November when I first set foot in the cabin. The late fall air in Wyoming had that crisp, biting quality that made every breath feel sharp in my lungs. I was 28, fresh out of a short stint working on the backcountry team, and had just been assigned to spend a couple of weeks alone at the park ranger cabin. The place was tucked away deep in the foothills of the Wind River Range, a solid 20-minute drive off the main trail, surrounded by towering pine trees and thick underbrush. The nearest ranger station was a good few hours' drive away, so I was on my own. The first few days were quiet, almost uneventful. The weather wasn't too bad yet, just the typical cool, overcast skies and occasional light rain. It was perfect, really. I had been out on my own in the wild for years and always preferred the isolation. At least I thought I did. The cabin was small, 2 rooms, a little kitchenette, a cot tucked into the corner, and a small wood stove that I kept roaring to make up for the thin walls. The job was simple enough. Check the perimeter of the park, ensure no one was trespassing, and take notes on any wildlife activity. Nothing too demanding. The routine settled in quickly. Most days, I'd head out before dawn, cover the same trails, check the usual spots, then come back to the cabin for a quick meal and some downtime. I'd take walks along the creek that ran near the cabin, sometimes getting lost in the distant echo of rushing water and the soft thrum of wind against the trees. But on the fourth day, everything changed. I had spent the morning patrolling the park's boundaries, marking down wildlife sightings and checking the trail cams that dotted the area. Around noon, I decided to take a different route back to the cabin. There was a small trail off to the side, one I hadn't walked yet, and I thought it might give me a nice view of the valley below. The path was narrow, overgrown with bushes and tall grass, but it wasn't impassable. It wound through a small forest where the ground was soft and damp. I kept my eyes open for any tracks or signs of human activity. This area was known for being fairly isolated, but sometimes people made their way through, usually lost hikers or those looking for illegal hunting spots. The trees were thick here, and the sun barely broke through the canopy. It felt different, heavier, like something was pressing down on the land. I kept walking, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It was when I reached a small clearing that I noticed something strange. The cabin wasn't large, maybe the size of a garage, and it was well hidden behind a line of low-growing trees and shrubs. The roof was slightly caved in on one side, and the wood had that gray, weathered look of something that had been abandoned for decades. No tracks were around it, no signs of life, just the empty, silent shell of a building that seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere. I don't know why, but the sight of it unnerved me. There was something about the way it just sat there, tucked away as if it had always been there, waiting for someone to find it. I cautiously approached, my boots crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. The door hung loosely on one hinge, swaying in the wind like it was on the verge of falling off. I pulled it open with a creak and stepped inside. The place was dusty and cold, the air stale with the scent of old wood and mold. There were no signs of anyone having been there recently, just some overturned furniture and scattered papers. But as I moved deeper into the room, something caught my eye. A set of muddy footprints on the floor. They led from the door to the far corner of the cabin, stopping at the window. I didn't think much of it at first. It was probably some animal or a hiker who'd wandered in. But the prints were too large to be from a deer or bear. They were human. I knelt down to inspect them more closely, but something made me pause. I heard a sound, a faint scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground. Came from outside, just beyond the window. I froze. The scrape came again, this time louder, more deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like someone was moving through the brush, slowly, as though they were trying to stay hidden. I moved to the window and peeked through the grime. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. No, him. A man stood just outside the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and his face was hidden under a worn, tattered hat. He stood completely still, like he was waiting for something or someone. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any other details, but there was something about the way he stood, almost like he was watching me. I backed away from the window, my hand instinctively going to the gun holstered at my side. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic. I wasn't sure if I should confront him or stay hidden. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but something rooted me to the spot. I waited, watching through a crack in the doorframe. Minutes passed. The man didn't move. I slowly made my way to the door, crouching down to avoid being seen. As I stepped out into the forest, I felt that familiar twinge of fear, the kind that tells you something is wrong, but you don't know why. I moved cautiously back toward the cabin, trying to make as little noise as possible. I must have made a mistake. Maybe the man wasn't there at all. Then the sound came again, the scrape, much closer this time, from behind the cabin. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. I had to act fast. Without thinking, I bolted for the woods, heading in the opposite direction. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to put as much distance between me and whatever the hell that man was. I didn't look back until I reached the creek. The water flowed quietly, a calm reminder that I had made it out. Still, the unease clung to me, and I couldn't shake the image of that man standing there, silent and motionless. When I returned to the cabin, it was empty. No signs of the man, no traces of him anywhere. The footprints had vanished. The world felt still again, like nothing had ever happened. But I couldn't erase the feeling of being watched. I'd been driving for hours, the sun barely hanging in the sky as it dipped behind the trees. The air had that cool bite to it, the kind that comes when fall is settling in but hasn't quite gripped the land. I could feel the weight of the old truck beneath me, every bump in the gravel road a reminder that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. But I had made the decision, and now there was no turning back. It was the cabin. My ex-wife, Emily, had left it to me in her will. I hadn't stepped foot there in over 5 years. Not since the divorce, not since everything had fallen apart. I hadn't wanted to, but after her passing, I'd gotten a call from her lawyer. The place was mine now, whether I liked it or not. There was no real reason to keep it, but I wasn't sure what to do with it either. Maybe I could sell it, maybe I could fix it up. Either way, I had to go there to figure it out. As the truck's engine rumbled into the quiet woods, the road seemed to narrow, and the trees seemed to close in tighter. The world outside the truck felt distant, like I was leaving everything behind. There wasn't much around here, just a few scattered houses in the distance, some old farms, and then wilderness. I could barely remember what the cabin looked like, but I had a feeling it would feel different now, haunted almost, in the sense that old memories always haunt a place. I pulled up to the cabin just as the last traces of sunlight disappeared. The structure stood there, weathered and rough around the edges, much like I remembered. There was no real driveway, just a clearing in the forest with tire tracks from old visits. The front steps were covered in leaves, and the porch light was flickering. The cabin wasn't much, just a small one-story place with a peaked roof, built years ago by Emily's father. He was a quiet man, always tinkering with something, the kind of guy who built everything himself. I'd never really gotten along with him, but I respected him. His work showed in the cabin. It was solid, built to last. I stepped out of the truck, feeling the dampness of the earth seep into my boots. The air smelled like pine and wood, familiar but strange now that I was back here alone. I grabbed the old, rusted key from my pocket. Emily had kept it in her drawer, one of those things she never let go of. When she'd passed, the key had been in the envelope the lawyer had handed me. The door creaked when I turned the handle, the wood groaning as if it were waking up from a long sleep. Inside, the air was musty, thick with dust and the smell of stagnant wood. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper that had long since peeled away in some places. The furniture was still there. Some of it was covered in white sheets, others left bare, showing signs of age and neglect. I could see the couch where Emily had always sat, her favorite spot by the window, looking out at the woods. She'd always been more in tune with nature than I was, always at peace here while I was just trying to get through the weekends. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't expect this heavy silence. The kind that presses down on you when you realize you're alone. No voices, no movement, just the creak of the house settling and the wind rustling through the trees outside. I dropped my bag by the door and stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. Felt like a different world here. Everything was still frozen in time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I wasn't sure if it was the cabin or me that had changed. I wandered through the place, checking the rooms one by one. The kitchen was small, with the old fridge still humming in the corner, the cabinets filled with chipped mugs and rusting cans. The bathroom was dark, with an old, cracked mirror reflecting a face I didn't recognize. More lines, more gray in my hair. The bedroom was the hardest. Emily's side of the bed was still there, the sheets wrinkled as if she'd just left it yesterday. It hurt more than I expected, but I couldn't sit with it. I had to keep moving. I had to do something. I decided to go outside. The porch was quiet, just the faint sound of crickets in the distance. The view from here was exactly how I remembered it. Trees stretching out into the horizon, a slow river winding through the forest. Nothing had changed in the land, but I noticed something else. The woods didn't feel like they used to. It was darker now, the shadows stretching farther than they should. The air was colder, sharper. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after so many years of not being here. But then I heard something, a rustling in the woods, a low sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't an animal, too deliberate, too heavy. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a bear, but I wasn't convinced. The sound was too close, too purposeful. I told myself I was just paranoid, that I needed to relax, but my body didn't listen. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. It was silly, I knew it was, but the idea of staying outside in the dark didn't sit right with me. I sat on the couch, trying to shake the feeling, but every creak and groan of the house seemed to grow louder. There was no one else here, no neighbors for miles, just me and whatever was out there in the dark. I made myself a drink, something strong to calm my nerves, and tried to focus. The wind picked up outside, and the trees swayed with it. The temperature dropped quickly. I could hear it whistling through the cracks in the walls, a reminder of just how empty the place felt. Then I heard it again, a noise. This time it was unmistakable. Someone was on the porch. I froze, my pulse quickening. The floorboards outside the door creaked under the weight of whoever it was, and I could hear the soft scrape of shoes on wood. I moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound, peering through the dusty blinds. Nothing. No one was there. I kept my eyes on the door, waiting, but the feeling didn't go away. My mind raced, running through all the possibilities, but none of them made sense. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard a car. Whoever or whatever was out there had to be close. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. It had to be my imagination, right? There was no way someone would be out here in the woods. Not at this hour. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening for any sign of movement. Every little sound in the house set me on edge. It was a long, restless night. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the cracks in the cabin, I didn't feel much better, but I knew I had to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here, something I couldn't explain. I packed up quickly, grabbing what I needed and heading back to the truck. The air felt different now, fresh and cool, but that sense of unease hadn't left. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin. It looked the same, standing alone in the woods, but I knew I couldn't stay. Not after last night, not with whatever had been out there. The road back felt longer than it had when I arrived. I couldn't wait to be out of the woods, away from that place. The silence of the cabin, the rustling in the trees. It was too much. The memory of that night would stay with me, just like the cabin would. Maybe I'd come back someday, but not now. Not yet. I'd been planning the trip for months. An old cabin in the woods, about 2 hours north of the small town I grew up in. The idea was simple. Get away from the city, disconnect, and find some peace for a few days. I needed the time to clear my head after a rough few months at work and the stress that came with it. It had been a long while since I'd done anything like this, and something about being alone in nature sounded perfect. I'd rented the cabin from a website that didn't seem to have many reviews. I didn't think much of it. The pictures looked all right, the cabin had the basics, and it was cheap. No one else had booked it, which meant I had the place all to myself. The drive there was long. I passed through winding country roads and little towns where time seemed to stand still. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already getting late. The sun had dipped behind the trees, leaving a cold, fading light. I didn't mind the darkness. I wasn't scared of being alone in the woods. In fact, it made everything feel more peaceful. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of aged wood that creaked under the weight of its own history. I could tell it had been here for years, decades, maybe. A single porch light flickered faintly above the front door, casting an eerie glow over the steps. I could see no signs of anyone else being around, which was just how I liked it. I grabbed my bag, a few supplies, and made my way inside. The inside of the cabin was exactly what I expected. Simple, rustic, with a stone fireplace in the corner and a couple of old wooden chairs around it. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust. There was a small kitchen area with a stove and fridge, though it looked like it hadn't been used much recently. The place felt isolated but not abandoned, just forgotten, maybe. I wasn't bothered by it. If anything, it felt like the perfect place to escape. I spent the first few hours getting settled in. I unpacked, made a small fire, and sat by it, watching the flames dance. The crackling sound of the wood was oddly comforting. I felt a calmness settle over me, and for the first time in a while, I allowed myself to relax completely. Around midnight, I decided to step outside. The night was crisp, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting shadows over the land. The woods stretched out in all directions, silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves. The air was cold but refreshing, and the faint smell of wood smoke hung in the air. I wandered a little ways from the cabin, just enough to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed something strange. At first, it was just a small shape in the distance near a cluster of trees. I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving through the shadows. But as I got closer, I realized it was too still, too out of place. I hesitated. There was something off about it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped forward cautiously, the ground crunching beneath my boots. It took me a moment to make out the shape more clearly, but then it hit me. A body. A man's body, lying face up in the dirt. My heart jumped in my chest, and every instinct screamed for me to turn around, but I couldn't. I wasn't sure if it was shock or something else that kept me rooted to the spot, but I stayed frozen, just staring. The body was partially covered by some leaves, but the face was exposed. Pale skin, eyes wide open, staring into nothing. The man was dressed in old, tattered clothes, and there was something oddly familiar about him. He was probably in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, but he looked worn out, like life had taken everything from him. I knelt down cautiously, my heart racing. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe a sign that he was still alive, some movement, a breath. But there was nothing. His body was cold, stiff, like it had been here for a while. His expression was frozen in terror, and that's when I noticed the deep cuts along his arms. They weren't fresh. The blood had dried, but it was still visible, staining his skin a dark brown. I recoiled slightly. I didn't want to touch him. I didn't know what had happened here, and I didn't want to get involved. But I couldn't leave either. Not without knowing what the hell was going on. Who was this man? How did he end up out here in the middle of nowhere? I glanced back at the cabin. It felt 100 miles away, even though it was only a short walk. I could leave. I could go back to the safety of the cabin, lock the door, and pretend I never saw this. But something inside me said no. I had to know what happened. I got up slowly, my legs shaking, and began to back away. But that's when I saw something else. It was another shape in the distance. Not a body, but a figure. a man standing just inside the tree line watching me. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see his silhouette clearly against the dark backdrop of the trees. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there staring. I froze again, feeling my heart pound in my chest. For a long moment, I didn't know what to do. The figure didn't move, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. Slowly, I turned and walked back toward the cabin, trying not to panic. My mind was racing. Was this some kind of trap? Was the man in the woods with the body somehow connected? Was he watching me now? I reached the cabin door, hands shaking as I fumbled with the handle. Once inside, I bolted the door shut and leaned against it, trying to calm my breathing. The silence of the cabin felt suffocating. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if it was safe anymore. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring into the flickering shadows of the fire. I kept hearing noises outside, the faintest creaks and cracks from the woods, but I didn't dare go out again. I was too afraid to even look through the window. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie quiet. The sun had risen, but the fog had rolled in thick, covering everything. I didn't want to stick around any longer. I packed up my things, gathered my stuff as quickly as I could, and left the cabin behind. I didn't go to the police. I didn't want to get involved. I still don't know what happened that night or who the man was, but I do know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to that cabin, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some things are better left untouched, and some questions are better left unanswered. It was a crisp autumn morning when I arrived at the cabin in the woods. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. I'd rented the place to get away from the noise of everyday life and clear my head. It was a small, rustic cabin tucked away deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from any main roads or towns. The air was still, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The cabin itself was old, built in the 1960s, and showed signs of age. The dark wooden walls creaked as I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning underfoot. There was a faint smell of pine in the air, mixed with the mustiness of a place that had been left alone for a while. A fire pit sat just outside, surrounded by a few scattered logs, and there was a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, their paint chipped from years of exposure to the elements. I dropped my duffel bag by the door and looked around. The place was basic but had everything I needed: a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen area, a couple of chairs, and a large, worn-out couch. There was no electricity, just a few solar-powered lights, which made the cabin feel even more isolated. But that's what I wanted: peace and quiet. No phone service, no distractions, just me and the mountains. I had planned to stay for 3 days, hiking during the day and reading at night. The weather was perfect for it, cool, with the sun breaking through the canopy of trees overhead. The forest was alive with the changing colors of fall, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me as I unpacked my things. That evening, I lit a fire in the stove and made myself a simple meal. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, and it made the solitude feel even more pronounced. It was peaceful, but as the night deepened and the shadows outside the cabin grew longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, and the cabin creaked with each gust. The fire in the stove flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I tried to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. It was just the wind, I told myself. But as the hours passed, I started hearing something else, a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the cabin. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the trees knocking against the cabin. But the sound didn't stop. It wasn't rhythmic like the wind. It was irregular, sharp, almost like someone was knocking on the walls. I froze, listening. My heart began to race. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The cabin was small, and the back wall was only a few feet away from where I was sitting. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the table and crept toward the back door. The tapping continued, louder now. It was unmistakable. A knock, then a pause, another knock, then silence. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. I had been alone for hours, and the isolation was starting to feel oppressive. But I knew I had to check. There was no way I could just ignore it. When I opened the door, the wind hit me immediately, biting cold. I shined the flashlight across the yard. Nothing, just the dark outline of the trees swaying in the wind. I stepped outside, looking around, but saw no movement. The tapping had stopped, and everything seemed still. I stood there for a moment, listening. The only thing I could hear was the rustling of leaves in the distance. Still feeling uneasy, I closed the door and locked it behind me. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. The woods were full of creatures, and the sounds of nature could be deceiving. But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin for a while. I wanted to get away from the strange feeling that had settled in. The hike through the forest was beautiful. Nothing but trees, rocks, and the occasional bird. The sun was high in the sky, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders ease with every step. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. There were footprints, fresh ones, deep in the dirt. They were large, more like boots than anything else. I squatted down to take a closer look, running my fingers along the edges of the prints. Whoever had left them had been here recently. My heart began to race again. I stood up quickly, scanning the woods around me. There was no sign of anyone, no noise, no movement. It was eerily quiet. The woods were supposed to be peaceful, but now they felt suffocating, as though someone was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I decided to head back to the cabin, my steps quickening with each passing moment. The last thing I wanted was to be out in the woods after dark, especially with the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally made it back, I locked the door behind me and pulled the curtains shut. That night, the tapping started again. Only this time it was louder, more insistent. It was coming from the front of the cabin now. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen in the dark, the sound echoing through the silence of the room. The wind had died down and it was just the tapping, knock, pause, knock, pause. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands trembling. I knew I had to check, but part of me didn't want to. What if it was someone out there? What if they were waiting for me to make a move? I stood by the window, peering out through the curtains, but saw nothing. The tapping didn't stop. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to get my attention. I was just about to open the door when I heard a noise from the side of the cabin. A twig snapped, then another. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my bag, stuffing it with my essentials, my phone, flashlight, a knife I kept in case of emergencies, and made for the back door. But when I opened it, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing just a few feet away, was a man. He was tall, thin, and wore a dark jacket with a hood that obscured most of his face. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me, cold and unblinking. He was staring at me, and I felt an icy shiver run down my spine. Without a word, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do. The forest was quiet once again, but my body was shaking with adrenaline. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the window watching for any sign of movement, but nothing came. The next morning, I packed up my things and left, not looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel a strange relief. I never learned who that man was or why he was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. The woods might have been beautiful, but they were also hiding something dark, and I had no intention of finding out what.